Before today's video starts, we just want to take a minute to talk about our amazing sponsor, The Ridge. When things recently escalated, I was on vacation, but one thing I didn't worry about in my travels was the items in my wallet because I had a Ridge wallet. Ridge wallets just aren't sleek looking, every wallet is equipped with RFID blocking. I'm not the only person who loves Ridge wallets, they have over 30,000 5-star reviews. I use a carbon fiber wallet, and it's great because it's lightweight and I feel comfortable carrying it in any pocket. Besides carbon fiber wallets, the Ridge has dozens of sleekly designed wallets that are made from aluminum and titanium. And the Ridge sells more than wallets. They have other fantastic products like phone cases and backpacks. Right now, the Ridge is offering criminally listed viewers 10% off with free worldwide shipping and returns. Just go to ridge.com/listed, that's ridge.com/listed, and use the promo code LISTED. Step up your wallet game today and help support Criminally Listed by checking out ridge.com/listed. Number 3. Steven Vanderslice. Steven Vanderslice met Jane Bowers in the spring of 1970 in Troy, New York. Steven was 19 and Jane was 15. They were both devout Jehovah's Witnesses and they were introduced by mutual friends at a meeting in a Kingdom Hall. After that initial meeting, they started dating. Jane's parents did not approve of the relationship. They thought that Steven was shifty and insincere. Nevertheless, Steven and Jane got engaged 5 days after Jane's 18th birthday. They were wed on September 10, 1974, in the same room where they first met. After they got married, the couple lived in Syracuse, New York. On May 26, 1975, Jane gave birth to a son. They named him Heath. A few weeks before Heath's first birthday, Steven took out a life insurance policy on his son. It would pay out $10,000 if Heath were to die. Just over 5 months later, on October 8, 1976, Steven called 911 because Heath was choking. Police officers arrived within minutes and they found Heath, who was 16 months old, unresponsive, and his face was blue. Steven told them that Heath had choked on a quarter. An officer started doing CPR, and then an ambulance took Heath to the hospital. But it was too late. Heath was pronounced dead. No autopsy was performed. When Heath died, Jane was 9 months pregnant. She gave birth 12 days after she lost her firstborn. It was a girl whom they named Heather. A week after Heather's birth, Steven got the insurance payout from Heath's death. With the $10,000, he bought a brand new Pontiac Trans Am. 6 weeks after Heather was born, Steven took out a $10,000 life insurance policy on his daughter. 4 weeks later, on the night of December 30th, 1976, Steven woke Jane up and told her that the baby wasn't breathing. Heather was rushed to the hospital. Heather stayed in the hospital for 4 days and then she was released. Less than a week later, on January 7, 1976, Steven was left home alone with the baby. When Jane got home, she found Heather dead in her bassinet. Her cause of death was labeled Sudden Infant Death Syndrome, which is also known by its acronym, SIDS. Soon after Heather's death, Steven collected the life insurance money. Not long after losing their second child, Jane found out that she was pregnant again. On October 14, 1977, 1977, Jane gave birth to a healthy girl. 1977, 1977, 1977, 1977, 1977, 1977, 1977, 1977, 1977, 1977, 1977, 1977, 1977, 1977, 1977, 1977, 1977, 1977, 1977, 1977, 1977, 1977, 1977, 1977, 1977, 1977, 1977, 1977, 1977, 1977, 1977, 1977, 1977, 1977, 1977, 1977, 1977, 1977, 1977, 1977, 1977, 1977, 1977, 1977, 1977, 1977, 1977, 1977, 1977, 1977, 1977, 1977, 1977, 1977, 1977, 1977, 1977, 1977, 1977, 1977, 1977, 1977, 1977, 1977, 1977, 1977, 1977, 1977, 1977, 1977, 1977, 1977, 1977, 1977, 1977, 1977, 1977, 1977, 1977, 1977, 1977, 1977, 1977, 1977, 1977, 1977, 1977, 1977, 1977, 1977, They bestowed her with the name Vicky. When Vicky was born, Jane and Stephen were living in Mechanicsville, New York. They had moved away from Syracuse after Heather's death. On the evening of January 11, 1979, Jane went to work. Stephen was at home with Vicky, who was 15 months old. When Jane came home, she went straight to the crib. She knew from looking at her that Vicky was dead, and she started screaming. Jane's father was sure that Stephen had something to do with the death of the children. He wanted the police to investigate, but the medical examiner did not find any evidence of foul play, and he determined that the cause of death was SIDS. Several people had a problem with this ruling because Vicky was 15 months old when she died. SIDS is incredibly rare after the age of 1. Nevertheless, the police did investigate, and they were suspicious of Stephen. After all, he was home alone with the children when they stopped breathing. But the investigators had a hard time wrapping their head around the idea that a father would kill his children. They felt they needed compelling evidence to even question him, and they only had circumstantial evidence. For example, it turned out that a month before Vicky died, Stephen had got a $30,000 life insurance policy on Vicky. Stephen called his insurance broker the day after Vicky died. With the money, Stephen bought himself a new suit, a stereo, and another Trans Am. This model was limited edition. Not only did Stephen financially benefit from the deaths of his 3 children, but he also liked the attention he got as a grieving father. People also got the sense that Stephen wanted all of Jane's attention, and he had been jealous of the children. In April 1981, just over 2 years after Vicky's death, Jane gave birth to a boy. They named him Shane. Jane refused to let Stephen take out a life insurance policy on Shane. It wasn't because she was suspicious of Stephen, she just thought it was bad luck. Nearly 2 years later, in March 1983, the couple welcomed another child, a daughter named Jennifer. In October 1984, a 16-year-old girl and her sister moved in with the Vanderslices. The girls were fellow Jehovah's Witnesses. They needed to be removed from their home because their father was abusive. Sometime after moving in, the 16-year-old girl and Stephen started a sexual relationship. About 6 months after moving in with the Vanderslices, the girls moved back home. The 16-year-old girl's mother found out that she was pregnant and that Stephen was the father. She reported Stephen to the police. The police questioned Stephen, and he admitted that he had been having sex with the girl. He was arrested, and he was charged with statutory rape. When Stephen was arrested, not only was the 16-year-old girl pregnant with his baby, but his wife, Jane, was also pregnant. Their due dates in October were 4 days apart. Stephen pleaded guilty to 36 different charges, and he was sentenced to a year in prison. After Stephen was sentenced, he talked to a reporter, and he blamed his actions on the grief he felt from the loss of his 3 children. He claimed that the losses gave him severe emotional problems. He said that the deaths were stressful and they made him impulsive. Stephen credited sleep apnea machines as the reason his 2 children, Shane and Jennifer, survived infanthood. At the time, one of the prevailing theories was that sleep apnea was one of the main causes of SIDS. Sleep apnea is a disorder where someone pauses breathing or has shallow breathing while they are sleeping. The theory first rose to prominence in October 1972 when the official journal of the American Academy of Pediatrics, which is also just known as Pediatrics, published an article by Dr. Alfred Steinschneider. In the article, Steinschneider discusses a family who had lost 5 young children, all under the age of 3. All 5 children had mysteriously stopped breathing. The family's name was not made public, and they were only identified by the letter H in the article. Steinschneider had been evaluating the 2 youngest children in the hospital before their deaths, and he noted that they had sleep apnea. He also points out that the 2 children died within a day of leaving the hospital after they were evaluated. In the article, Steinschneider also argued that there is a hereditary element to SIDS. Eventually, in the medical community, it seemed to be an accepted fact that sleep apnea was one of the leading causes of SIDS. An editor of Pediatrics said that it jumped from a decent hypothesis to a religion. The article launched a cottage industry of selling sleep apnea machines to worried parents. The day after Stephen was sentenced, the article where he blamed his behavior on the death of his children was published. A detective in Syracuse who had investigated Stephen in the past read the article. He had always suspected that Stephen had killed his kids. He was disgusted that Stephen would use the death of his children to excuse the fact that he had sexually abused a girl who was in his care. So in September 1985, the detective brought Stephen in for questioning regarding the deaths of his children. After some questioning, Stephen admitted to killing his daughters, Heather and Vicky. He swore that Heath's death was an accident and he had nothing to do with it. After the confession, the bodies of Heath, Heather, and Vicky were all exhumed. But the medical examiner did not find any evidence of foul play in the autopsies that followed. Detectives continued to interview Stephen. He seemed to enjoy the attention he got from the detectives. Stephen would also lead the detectives on by giving them vague answers. Then finally, Stephen said he held Heather and Vicky's faces against his chest until they stopped breathing. He refused to budge on his story that Heath had choked on a quarter. Stephen was asked why he killed his children, and he said it was not because of the money. He said he wanted his wife, Jane, to love him more. In October 1985, the teenage girl Stephen had sexually abused gave birth to a son. A week later, his wife, Jane, also gave birth to his son. Around the same time, Stephen was charged with the murder of his daughter Vicky. In September 1986, Stephen accepted a plea deal where he pleaded guilty to manslaughter and he was sentenced to 8.5 years to 25 years of prison. When Stephen's other children, Heath and Heather, died, he and Jane were living in Syracuse, which is in Onondaga County. William Fitzpatrick, the Chief Assistant District Attorney of Onondaga County, decided to only charge Stephen with the murder of Heather. Fitzpatrick refused to make a plea deal. Days after Stephen pleaded guilty to manslaughter, he went to trial for Heather's murder. Famed pathologist Dr. Linda Norton was to testify on behalf of the district attorney. Before Norton testified, she and Fitzpatrick met to discuss the case. The case reminded Norton of Dr. Albert Steinschneider's 1972 article in Pediatrics. Norton did not think that Steinschneider's conclusions were accurate. In her own research, she had never found evidence that sleep apnea led to SIDS. She also had never seen evidence that SIDS was hereditary. Norton mentioned the article to Fitzpatrick and told him that the deaths weren't the result of SIDS. Instead, it was the work of a serial killer. She told Fitzpatrick about the case study because it took place in Syracuse. Fitzpatrick noted what Norton said, but he decided to focus on the case at hand. At the trial, Stephen's lawyer pointed out that there was no physical evidence that Heather's death was anything but natural. That's what it said on the initial autopsy report, and the second autopsy did not reveal any signs of foul play either. Dr. Norton testified, and she said that there is no evidence that SIDS is hereditary. So the odds of more than one child in one family dying from SIDS is incredibly high. Stephen's taped confession was also played in court. Stephen Vanderslice was ultimately found guilty, and he was sentenced to 25 years to life. Number 2. Waneta Hoyt. Waneta Ethel Nixon was born in July 1946 in Richford, New York. Not long after she was born, the Nixons' fourth born, Robert, passed away. Robert was 2.5 years old, and he died of spinal meningitis. A year after Waneta was born, Dorothy became pregnant again. During the delivery in 1947, the umbilical cord wrapped around the baby's neck, and he did not survive the birth. Like the other son the Nixons lost, this baby was also named Robert. 2 years later, Dorothy gave birth to her final child, which was another daughter. When Waneta was 11, she contracted measles, and it nearly left her completely blind. Without her glasses, she could only see shadows. Waneta's family life was typical, but her family was described as cold and distant. Waneta wasn't very social. She often kept to herself and enjoyed activities like reading. Waneta was an average student. When Waneta started high school, she met Tim Hoyt, who was a senior. They started dating after Tim finished high school. When Waneta was 17 years old, they decided to get married. Waneta's mother, Dorothy, did not approve of the marriage, and she kicked Waneta out of her home a week before the wedding. Waneta ended up moving onto Tim's family farm in Newark Valley, New York. They were wed in a small ceremony. Dorothy did not attend the wedding. After Waneta got married, the principal of her school told her not to return to school because he thought she would be a bad influence on the other students. For example, she could tell the other students about her sex life. So Waneta dropped out. Not long after they were wed, Waneta found out that she was pregnant. She gave birth on October 17, 1964, to a son, Eric. Eric was healthy, and the medical staff found nothing wrong with him. But in the months after Waneta took Eric home, she said he would stop breathing and he would turn blue. She brought him to see doctors, but none of them could find anything wrong with the boy. One doctor thought he might be getting pneumonia, so he prescribed antibiotics. Eric was not the only one who supposedly had health problems. Waneta always thought she was suffering from a new type of ailment. Her friends and family thought she was a hypochondriac. She also had fainting spells. But many people who witnessed these spells thought they were fake, and Waneta was just doing them to get attention. On January 26, 1965, Waneta was home alone with Eric, who was 3 months old. She said she was feeding him, and suddenly he stopped breathing. Waneta ran and got a neighbor. They went back to her home, and Waneta performed CPR on Eric. But sadly, nothing could be done to help him. Everyone thought that Eric's death was a tragic but natural death. There was no police investigation, and no autopsy was performed. Later that same year, Waneta became pregnant. She ultimately miscarried, but she got pregnant again soon afterward. Waneta gave birth to a son named James on the last day of May 1966. The next year, Waneta, Tim, and James moved off of Tim's family farm into a mobile home near the farm. Tim worked as a laborer, and Waneta was a stay-at-home mother. Waneta became pregnant again, and she gave birth on July 19, 1968. It was a girl whom they named Julie. Both James and Julie were healthy when they left the hospital. On September 5, 1968, Waneta was home alone with the two kids. A neighbor heard screaming. She discovered that it was Waneta screaming for help. Waneta explained she had been feeding Julie rice cereal, and then suddenly she stopped breathing. An ambulance took Julie to the hospital, where she was pronounced dead. She had only been alive for 48 days. No autopsy was performed. Everyone took Waneta's word for it, and the cause of death was put down as choking. Waneta, Tim, and James lived down the road from their best friends, Art and Natalie Hillard. 3 weeks after Julie died, Natalie heard screaming outside of her home. She stepped outside and saw Waneta running down the road with 2.5-year-old James in her arms. Waneta explained that James had been playing outside. When he came back inside, he collapsed in the hallway and stopped breathing. An ambulance was called, and a paramedic performed CPR on the boy. But the coroner came and declared James dead on the scene. For the first time, an autopsy was performed on one of the Hoyt children. The coroner was not able to determine the cause of death. Some people speculated that Waneta may have done something to her children, but there was no evidence that she did anything wrong. So while people had their suspicions, there was nothing they could do. In early 1969, Waneta became pregnant again, but she miscarried. Later that same year, Waneta found out that she was pregnant again. On March 18, 1970, Waneta gave birth to a daughter, Molly. The doctors were aware that the Hoyts had lost 3 children, so they did extensive testing on Molly. But Molly seemed to be healthy. She was sent home with Waneta and Tim 4 days after she was born. 4 days after that, Waneta claimed she went to get Molly from her crib and found her not breathing. She claimed she was able to get Molly breathing again. Waneta took Molly to the doctor, but it was a mystery to him as to what caused her to suddenly stop breathing. Less than 2 weeks later, the baby had another apparent attack. This time, Waneta and Tim were recommended to Dr. Alfred Steinschneider. Steinschneider was a pediatrician at the Upstate Medical Center in Syracuse, New York. Steinschneider was trying to stem the number of children who die from sudden infant death syndrome, which is also known as SIDS. Steinschneider believed that SIDS was caused by sleep apnea. Steinschneider accepted Molly into a study, and Molly was admitted into the hospital. Supposedly, Steinschneider noted, at times, Molly would stop breathing while she was sleeping. However, she never stopped breathing to the point where she needed to be revived. In fact, Molly was hooked up to a monitor that would set off an alarm if she stopped breathing for 15 seconds. During her hospital stay, the alarm was not triggered a single time. Molly spent 24 days in the hospital, and then she was sent home with her parents. Dr. Steinschneider had Waneta and Tim take a sleep apnea machine home for Molly to use. It was the first time in the United States that a baby was sent home with a sleep apnea machine. Molly lasted for about a day and a half at home, and then Waneta said Molly stopped breathing and she had to revive her. Molly was placed back into the hospital. Molly spent nearly a month in the hospital, and then she was sent back home with Tim and Waneta. Once again, during Molly's hospital stay, she did not stop breathing. The day after Molly was discharged, she died. Molly was just shy of being 3 months old. Waneta said that Molly was napping, and then the alarm on the sleep apnea machine went off. Waneta called for an ambulance, and then she performed CPR on Molly while she waited for the ambulance. But there was nothing that could be done to help Molly. Despite the fact that Molly was in a medical study of SIDS, there was no autopsy. Weeks after losing their fourth child, Waneta found out she was pregnant yet again. Waneta gave birth on May 19, 1971, which was Mother's Day. This time it was a boy whom they named Noah. Noah stayed in a local hospital in Newark Valley for 4 days, and then he was transferred to the Upstate Medical Center in Syracuse. Noah was discharged on June 13, 1971, a month after he was placed in the hospital. 3 days later, Waneta said that Noah stopped breathing and she had to revive him. He was sent back to the Upstate Medical Center. The loss of his 4 children was tough on Tim Hoyt. When Tim saw that Noah was having similar problems, he suspected that something hereditary was causing it. So while Noah was in the hospital, Tim decided to get a vasectomy so that he and Waneta couldn't have any more children together. Noah was released from the hospital on July 27, 1971. Like his sister Molly, there was never a major problem with Noah while he was staying in the hospital. But later, Dr. Albert Steinschneider would claim that Noah had suffered from sleep apnea. The next day, Tim left Noah, who was 2.5 months old, home alone with 25-year-old Waneta. Waneta said she found Noah unresponsive in his crib and he was blue. She said she performed CPR, but it was too late to help him. An autopsy was performed on Noah. The cause of death was labeled SIDS. A week after the death of their 5th child, Waneta and Tim applied to adopt a child. They had tried several other times to adopt, but Waneta always became pregnant and they never went through with the adoption plan. On November 19, 1971, less than 4 months after they lost Noah, Tim and Waneta were given an infant boy to care for. The boy was supposed to stay with Waneta and Tim for 6 months. But then Waneta had the baby taken out of their custody after a few days. In October 1972, the official journal of the American Academy of Pediatrics, also known as Pediatrics, published an article by Dr. Alfred Steinschneider. He discusses the Hoyts and the loss of their 5 children, but he only identified the family using the letter H. His article argued that sleep apnea was a major contributing factor to SIDS, and there may be a genetic element to SIDS. It was considered a landmark article in the study of SIDS. As we mentioned in the previous segment about Steven van der Sluys, it eventually became an accepted fact that sleep apnea contributed to SIDS, and SIDS was possibly genetic. The article made Steinschneider one of the leading experts on SIDS. In June 1974, Waneta accused a neighbor of sexually assaulting her. She told everyone in the neighborhood about the incident, but she refused to press charges against him. On September 20th, 1976, about 5 years after they lost their last child, Tim and Waneta adopted a boy who was 2 months old, named Jay. Amazingly, Jay survived childhood in the Hoyt household. Dr. Steinschneider thought that this further proved his point that there was a hereditary element to SIDS. While the deaths of children had stopped, other strange things happened around Waneta. For example, on 2 different occasions, their trailer caught fire. Both times, Waneta said that the fires were caused by the furnace exploding. Then in April 1984, Steven van der Sluys was arrested for statutory rape. Several months later, Steven was charged with the murders of his daughters, Vicky and Heather. William Fitzpatrick was the prosecutor when Steven went to trial in September 1987 for the murder of Heather. During the trial, Fitzpatrick met a highly respected pathologist, Dr. Linda Norton. During one of their conversations, Norton mentioned Dr. Steinschneider's 1972 article. It told Fitzpatrick that the family's identity wasn't public, but the study happened in his county. She also said that those children didn't die from SIDS. Instead, they were murdered by a serial killer. Fitzpatrick noted what she said, but at the time, he was focused on prosecuting Steven van der Sluys. In November 1990, over 6 years after Steven van der Sluys' trial, William Fitzpatrick was elected District Attorney of Onondaga County. One of the first cases he ordered to be investigated was the H family, where the focus of Dr. Alfred Steinschneider's famous study into the connection between sleep apnea and SIDS. Fitzpatrick had never forgotten what Norton said about the deaths being the work of a serial killer instead of 5 natural deaths. Fitzpatrick knew he probably could have gone to Steinschneider directly to find out the family's name. Instead, he decided to have an investigator figure out the identity of the family. In the article, Steinschneider refers to the youngest family member as NH, and he cites an autopsy number. Using that information, the investigator learned that the boy's name was Noah Hoyt. From there, he learned the identity of the rest of the family. Fitzpatrick was surprised to learn that Noah and Molly had stayed in a hospital in Syracuse, but they and their siblings had died at home in Newark Valley, which was in a different county. So Fitzpatrick passed the information off to the district attorney in that county, Robert Simpson. Simpson launched an investigation. But after 15 months, there was no progress, and William Fitzpatrick was frustrated. He wanted to take the case back and prosecute it himself. Fitzpatrick argued that the parents had taken the babies from a hospital in his county with the intent to harm them. Simpson did not want to lose the case, so he assigned senior investigator with the state police, Bob Courtwright, to the case. Courtwright collected as much information as he could. Then he had pathologist Dr. Michael Baden look at the medical records. Baden thought that there was something suspicious about the deaths. He concluded that all 5 children were murdered. Another pathologist reviewed the files, and he agreed with Dr. Baden the children had been murdered. A sleep apnea expert looked at the records and found no evidence that the Hoyt children suffered from sleep apnea. The 2 pathologists believed that the killer was the mother of the children, Waneta. They thought she was a textbook case of Munchausen by proxy syndrome. They did not think that Tim knew his wife had killed their children. Part of the Munchausen by proxy syndrome pattern is that the person with the condition often has an incredibly loyal partner. In most cases, they are blind to what their partner might have done. On March 23, 1994, 21 and a half years after Noah died, Waneta Hoyt was brought in for questioning. The detective started off by asking her about the lives of her children and then how they died. The detectives noted that the stories Waneta told them were different from their records. For example, Waneta said that James had been playing outside, then he came inside and died in the hallway. But she was now telling the detectives that James died after he ate. The detectives confronted her about the inconsistencies. Then they told her that they knew she had killed her children. Waneta broke down crying, and she said she had asked God for forgiveness more times than she could count. Waneta then went through the death of each child and explained how she killed them. In January 1965, she suffocated Eric with a pillow. In September 1968, Waneta held Julie to her shoulder and suffocated her. 3 weeks later, she smothered James with a bath towel. In June 1970, Waneta smothered Molly with a pillow as she laid in her crib. Then in July 1978, she killed Noah by suffocating him with a pillow. Waneta said that each time she killed them, it was because they were crying. She said she couldn't stand the crying. Waneta Hoyt was arrested for all 5 murders. She went to trial in Tioga County in the spring of 1994. Waneta pleaded not guilty. The prosecution did not have much in the way of physical evidence. Also, the last death happened 16 years earlier. What the prosecution did have was Waneta's confession. The prosecution had the confession read aloud in court. Waneta's defense lawyer countered that the confession was coerced and she had not been informed of her Miranda rights. The prosecutor also had pathologist Dr. Michael Baden testify. Baden said that the odds of so many children dying after they suddenly stopped breathing under the age of 3 were astronomical. To argue against this, the defense cited other cases where families had lost more than one child to SIDS. Dr. Steinschneider testified on behalf of Waneta. He was adamant that Molly and Noah had died from SIDS, which was caused by sleep apnea. Steinschneider had good reason to be defensive about the theory that linked sleep apnea to SIDS. After all, it had been his life's work. Before meeting the Hoyts, Steinschneider had spent years and used millions of dollars looking for a link between sleep apnea and SIDS. When he found the Hoyts, he thought that they proved his theory, and he ignored any evidence that went against it. His article has been cited in over 400 other articles regarding the study of SIDS. When Waneta was arrested and being tried, Steinschneider was the head of the American SIDS Institute. The American SIDS Institute was founded by a former aerospace engineer. The engineer had experienced the nightmare of losing a son to SIDS. He developed a sleep apnea machine for infants prone to SIDS. The machine was endorsed by the American Academy of Pediatrics. His company ended up selling $90 million worth of sleep apnea machines. When he founded the American SIDS Institute in 1983, he hired Dr. Alfred Steinschneider to be the head of the institute. The problem was that no one had ever replicated Steinschneider's results. Also, there was no evidence that sleep apnea machines had any effect on the rate of SIDS. But other research had been done on SIDS, and other potential contributing factors were found. For example, there are higher rates of SIDS among babies who were born to mothers who had drank and smoked while they were pregnant. Another practice that drastically changed the rate of SIDS was having the baby sleep on their back instead of their side or their stomach. Since Steinschneider published this article, another theory has rose to prominence that would explain what happened to the Hoyt children. That was that caregivers were hurting children under their care in a bid to get attention for themselves. Munchausen by proxy syndrome was first used to describe a form of child abuse in 1977, 5 years after Steinschneider's article was published in Pediatrics. Today, the condition is known as factitious disorder imposed on another, and it can involve vulnerable victims of any age. While many people in the medical community believe that SIDS and sleep apnea were connected, there were some critics of the theory. Several months after the article was published, Dr. John Hicks, a Minneapolis pediatrician, had his response to the article published in Pediatrics. Dr. Hicks suggested that the kids were victims of abuse and they did not die of SIDS. So at Waneta's trial, the prosecution tried to discredit Dr. Steinschneider's article. The prosecution had 2 nurses who worked on Steinschneider's study testify. They said they never saw Noah or Molly suffer any breathing problems. In Steinschneider's response to Hicks' letter, he said on 2 different occasions the children stopped breathing to the point where the nurses had to stimulate the babies. However, Steinschneider did not have any record of a nurse doing that in his own notes. Nor did any nurse remember stimulating the children. Nevertheless, on the stand, Steinschneider was adamant that the children had to be stimulated. When the prosecutor asked Steinschneider what evidence he had to prove that, Steinschneider said, "I wrote it, therefore it's true." The prosecutor then flat out accused Steinschneider of fabricating evidence. Steinschneider denied this. The prosecution also had several people testify that Waneta was cold and distant with her children. When she held them as babies, she often held them away from her body. Several people also talked about her being a hypochondriac who had an addictive need for her husband's attention. An expert testified, and he said that Waneta killed the children because she was suffering from Munchausen by proxy syndrome. Waneta took the stand in her own defense. Waneta claimed she had been tricked into saying she had killed her children and she had never really hurt them. On cross-examination, the prosecutor accused Waneta of loving all the attention she was getting from the trial. Waneta denied this accusation. Throughout the 4-week trial, Waneta's husband, Tim, supported her. The jury ended up deliberating for 12 hours over 2 days. On April 20th, 1995, Waneta was found guilty of 5 counts of second-degree murder. For each count, she was sentenced to 15 years. She was ordered to serve each sentence back to back, effectively giving her a 75-year sentence. She ended up serving just over 3 years. In August 1998, Waneta Hoyt died in prison at the age of 52 from pancreatic cancer. After the trial, Dr. Albert Steinschneider was heavily criticized and his article was discredited. To many people, it was clear that he cared more about the theory than he did about his patients. People also wonder how many killers got away with murder because the pathologist thought that the child had died from SIDS caused by sleep apnea. They also wonder how many lives were lost because of how much research was done connecting sleep apnea to SIDS. Steinschneider's article has been cited over 400 times. It was the most cited SIDS paper in the 1970s. In 2017, Dr. James R. Wright Jr. published an article called A Fresh Look at the History of SIDS for Academic Pathology. In it, he called Steinschneider's article cataclysmic. Another problem was that Steinschneider was the head of the American SIDS Institute. It was the most dominant SIDS research institute in the United States. Steinschneider essentially torpedoed other studies looking for other causes of SIDS besides sleep apnea. After Waneta Hoyt was convicted, Steinschneider did not admit any wrongdoing and he never apologized. He also never publicly wavered in his opinion that sleep apnea was the leading cause of SIDS. After the trial, Steinschneider continued to work as the head of the American SIDS Institute. He retired in 1998, but he continued to publish papers on SIDS until 2008. Dr. Albert Steinschneider died in 2018 at the age of 88. Number 1. Jeannie Jones. Jeannie Jones was born in July 1950 in San Antonio, Texas. She was promptly put up for adoption by her birth parents. When she was an infant, she was adopted by Dick and Gladys Jones. Jeannie was one of 4 adopted children that the couple had. Dick owned a notorious nightclub in town that was a suspected gambling hotspot. The family lived in a big house on a large plot of land in San Antonio. In 1963, Dick sold his nightclub and he started a billboard company. He ran the company out of a workshop on his property. In November 1966, the youngest of the Jones children, 14-year-old Travis, was in the workshop. Travis, who had learning disabilities, had built himself a pipe bomb. As he was working on it, the bomb exploded. Travis died hours later in the hospital. Jeannie was just 2 years older than Travis. By all accounts, she was devastated by the loss of her brother. What Jeannie's friends thought was odd was that Jeannie returned to school just hours after the memorial service. She seemed to like the attention she got from people over the death of her brother. Jeannie was not popular in school. She was considered plain-looking and her personality was off-putting. She was described as bossy and obnoxious. She was also a bit of a troublemaker. Whenever Jeannie would get in trouble, she would blame someone else for her problems. For example, the kids at her school didn't like her because they thought her father was a gambler. Or she claimed she acted out because her family life was hard because she was considered the black sheep of her family. Jeannie was also a notorious liar. She would apparently say anything to get attention. Jeannie was close to her father. He died from cancer in January 1968 when Jeannie was 17. Jeannie got married to her high school sweetheart 2 weeks after she graduated high school. In January 1972, Jeannie gave birth to a son. They named him Richard in honor of Jeannie's late father. The couple's marriage did not last. They got divorced about 18 months later. Months later, Jeannie's eldest brother died of cancer. After losing her brother and father to cancer, Jeannie became terrified of cancer. Any ailment she had, she thought it was a sign of cancer. In 1975, Jeannie got pregnant again. She told most people that the father was her ex-husband, but the father was really a beauty supply salesman who was gay. Jeannie and the salesman had been friends. Then Jeannie manipulated him into having sex with her. In June 1976, Jeannie enrolled in nursing school. In May 1977, she graduated, and then a month after that, she gave birth to a daughter. In October 1978, Jeannie got a job in the pediatric intensive care unit at the Bexar County Hospital in San Antonio. The unit was for children up to the age of 16. This did not include newborns. They had their own neonatal ICU. The pediatric ICU was for children who had lived at least some of their life outside the hospital. Jeannie was far from a perfect nurse. In her first year on the job, she was written up 8 times. One time, she had been observing a young female patient for 2 straight shifts. She was ordered to go home after the second shift. She refused to leave the child's bedside, and security guards had to force her out. But then she returned to the hospital hours later, smelling of alcohol, and she was swaying. Jeannie went directly to the young girl's room, and she started to use the medical equipment that was in the patient's room. Jeannie was once again forced to leave the hospital. The problem was that there was a shortage of nurses in Texas. So Jeannie held on to her job despite her odd behavior. Jeannie also seemed to notice symptoms in a patient that no one else saw. Often, the doctors and residents thought that she was making up the ailments. Jeannie herself was a hypochondriac. In 2.5 years, she visited the emergency room 30 times. In early 1981, Jeannie started to demand being assigned to the sickest patients. Many nurses did not want to be assigned to the sickest children because there was a higher risk that the patient might die. When Jeannie was assigned to a patient she didn't like, she had become difficult. Her supervisors just thought it was easier to let her do what she wanted. This gave Jeannie free rein to do what she wanted in the pediatric ICU. In a hospital, when a patient is in a dire condition, a code is initiated. When the patient codes, doctors and nurses rush into the room and try to save the patient's life. Jeannie admitted she found it exciting when patients coded. She said it would get her keyed up. On May 21st, 1981, a patient in Jeannie's care, Chris Hageda, suddenly died. No one considered the death to be shocking. Chris was 16 months old and he had been born with a heart defect. He had been admitted into the hospital 6 months earlier. During his hospital stay, he developed hepatitis. After Chris's death, other children in the ICU developed mysterious ailments. For example, the blood of some babies would not clot. Other children would just stop breathing or go into cardiac arrest. There was also a significant increase in the amount of deaths in the pediatric ICU. On July 3, 1981, 8-month-old Richard Nelson went into cardiac arrest and died. On August 11, 1981, Terry Lynn Garcia, who was about 2 months old, died after going into cardiac arrest. It was the 5th time she had gone into cardiac arrest. Days later, Patricia Sambrino, 3 months old, died after going into cardiac arrest for the 3rd time. Just over a month later, on September 16, 1981, 2-year-old Rosemary Vega died while she was recovering from heart surgery. Just over a week later, on September 24th, 3-month-old Paul Villarreal died. What was odd about Paul's death was that he just had elective surgery on his skull. His health only took a turn for the worse after he was placed in the ICU to recover. Not long afterward, 4-month-old Placida Barra was placed in the ICU because she had suffered heart failure. The first day that she was in the ICU, someone noticed that 100% oxygen was being fed to her through a respirator, which is dangerous. 5 days later, Placida went into cardiac arrest and she died. One night in the pediatric ICU, 2 babies coded at the same time. Nurses and doctors worked on one of the babies and they were able to stabilize the baby. Then they went to help the second child, but unfortunately, that baby passed away. Then they had to go back and help the first baby because the baby had gone into cardiac arrest again. They were not able to revive the baby, and the child was pronounced dead shortly afterward. The identities of the 2 children have not been made public. One thing that several nurses in the pediatric ICU noticed was that most of the patients had problems or died when Jeannie Jones was on duty. Jeannie even joked that people were going to start considering her the death nurse. Some of the nurses thought that something much more sinister was going on. They thought that Jeannie was harming and killing the children. The head nurse of the pediatric ICU, Pat Belko, heard the other nurses' suspicions about Jeannie. Belko believed that Jeannie was abrasive and a bit odd, but she believed that Jeannie was a good nurse. Also, early in her career, Belko had accidentally given a baby the wrong dosage of a drug, and the baby died. Belko was accused of purposely killing the baby, and the police investigated her. They found no evidence of wrongdoing. Because of her own experience, Belko did not want to accuse someone of the same thing without evidence. In October 1981, one of Jeannie's fellow nurses accumulated a list of how many children coded and died while Jeannie was on duty. When she showed the list to Pat Belko, Belko became disturbed and she informed her supervisor. But the supervisor did not think anything too suspicious was going on because Jeannie worked with the sickest children. Therefore, her death rate would be higher than the average nurse. A doctor who worked in the ICU also went to his supervisor with his suspicions of Jeannie. One thing he noted was that the babies would often bleed when they were being resuscitated, and their blood wouldn't clot. He thought that Jeannie was giving the children a drug called heparin. Also, several children had the rate of their heartbeats drop to dangerously low levels. The doctor believed that Jeannie was also injecting the children with Valium. The doctor told his supervisor that he wanted to continue to investigate because while he had his suspicions, he could not prove anything. So while some people considered Jeannie dangerous, she continued to work. On October 10, 1981, 6-month-old Jose Antonio Flores died after spending 4 days in the pediatric ICU. Jose had been hospitalized because he had diarrhea, a fever, he was vomiting, and he was dehydrated. On his 3rd day in the hospital, he had a seizure and he went into cardiac arrest. Also, his blood had stopped clotting, but he was ultimately revived. On his 4th day in the ICU, he went into cardiac arrest and he died. On October 17th, just a week after Jose died, Jeannie was caught trying to give a baby an overdose of heparin. Jeannie explained that it had been a mistake and no action was taken. Jeannie continued to seek treatment for herself on ailments she claimed she had. In late October, Jeannie went to the emergency room. She complained she had symptoms of a bowel obstruction, so she was hospitalized for 17 days. During those 2.5 weeks when she was in the hospital, there wasn't a death in the pediatric ICU. On November 10th, a report about Jeannie was sent to the hospital's top administrator, but he did not think anything needed to be done. On December 8th, 1981, 11-month-old Josh Sawyer was pulled out of a house fire. Unfortunately, he had suffered mass smoke inhalation. He was brought into the pediatric ICU in a coma. 3 days later, it seemed like he was getting better, but he remained in a coma. Then Jeannie took over caring for Josh. He died on her 2nd shift. Several nurses and doctors were now convinced that Jeannie was doing something to the children. At the very least, they wanted her fired. However, hospital officials thought that Jeannie was the victim of a witch hunt. They found no evidence that she had done anything wrong, so they were not going to fire her. In fact, one doctor who thought that Jeannie was hurting children was transferred out of the pediatric ICU. In December 1981, 6 children died while Jeannie was on duty. Just after Christmas 1981, Rolando Santos was admitted to the pediatric ICU with pneumonia. On January 6, while Jeannie was working, Rolando mysteriously started bleeding. He was given a drug that counteracts the effects of heparin. It was a risky move by the doctor because if Rolando had not been given heparin, the new drug he gave Rolando would make his condition worse. But after a few minutes, the bleeding stopped, indicating the baby had been given heparin. Rolando was moved out of the ICU before Jeannie's next shift. Rolando's health improved, and he was released to his parents. On January 14, 1982, 4-month-old Patrick Zavala was placed in the ICU after undergoing open-heart surgery. The operation had gone well, and the surgeon expected Patrick to make a full recovery. In Patrick's first 3 days in the ICU, he was doing well. Jeannie had been off for those 3 days. Then on January 17th, Jeannie returned to work. On Jeannie's first shift, she claimed she found Patrick unresponsive, and she got a doctor. The doctor tried to stimulate Patrick, and then he went into cardiac arrest. Patrick was pronounced dead minutes later. After the death, a surgeon who watched Patrick's operation complained to a hospital official. He said that over the past 9 months, there had been too many deaths in the pediatric ICU. The hospital official started to investigate, and he discovered that other hospital officials were made aware months earlier that a nurse might be harming children. This led to an ad hoc committee which discussed the deaths in the pediatric ICU. While they were meeting, a baby in the pediatric ICU went into cardiac arrest after Jeannie left his room. The baby was attached to a heart monitor that was equipped with an alarm that would go off if something went wrong with the baby's heart. But the alarm did not sound when the baby went into cardiac arrest. It turned out that the alarm had been turned off. A nurse found the baby unresponsive and she revived him. In February 1982, the committee ordered an investigation into the pediatric ICU. Jeannie heard about the investigation and she apparently welcomed it for the benefit of the children. Jeannie was a licensed vocational nurse, also known as an LVN. In the ranking of nurses, an LVN is lower than a registered nurse, which is also known as an RN. The result of the investigation was that all the LVNs in the pediatric ICU would be replaced with RNs. Jeannie was told she could apply to work in a different department, but she chose to resign effective March 17, 1982. Amazingly, even though several people had accused Jeannie of murdering children, no note of the accusations was made in her file. Kathy Holland was a resident at the Bexar County Hospital, and she planned on opening a pediatric clinic in Kerrville, Texas, once she was done her residency. She hired Jeannie to work as a nurse in the clinic. The clinic in Kerrville opened in August 1982. The second day they were open, their first patient was 14-year-old Chelsea McCullen. Since birth, Chelsea had a series of breathing problems. Jeannie was alone in a room with Chelsea when Chelsea suddenly stopped breathing. Chelsea was rushed to the hospital and she survived. Just over a week later, on August 27, 1982, 1-month-old Brandy Benitez was left alone with Jeannie. Brandy suddenly stopped breathing and had to be rushed to the hospital. Brandy survived and she was released from the hospital a short time later. On August 30th, 3 days after Brandy stopped breathing, Jeannie was left alone with 4-month-old Chris Parker in a room in the clinic. He suddenly stopped breathing and had to be revived. Chris was taken to the local hospital in Kerrville, St. Peterson Memorial, in an ambulance. Janine rode in the ambulance with him. While Chris was in the emergency room, 7-year-old Jimmy Pearson was brought into the hospital because he had stopped breathing. Jimmy had a defective heart and a hereditary bone condition. He was also one of Dr. Holland's patients. Dr. Holland ordered Chris and Jimmy to be airlifted to the Santa Rosa Hospital, which was a bigger hospital than the one in Kerrville. Jeannie went on the helicopter with them. On the trip, Jeannie was examining 7-year-old Jimmy, and she told the paramedic there was something wrong with him. Then Jeannie injected Jimmy with some unknown substance. Moments later, Jimmy went into cardiac arrest. Jimmy was revived, and then he was hospitalized. He remained in the hospital for 7 weeks. He was released to his parents, but then not long afterward, he had to be put back into the hospital. Jimmy died on October 21st, 1982. Chris Parker was released from the hospital after 3 days. The medical staff had no idea why he suddenly stopped breathing. On September 3, 1982, Misty Reichnow was brought into Dr. Holland's clinic because she had ulcers in her mouth. Jeannie placed an IV into Misty's arm, and then Misty had a seizure. Misty was taken to the hospital and released a few days later. On September 17th, the parents of Chelsea McCullen brought her back into the pediatric clinic. After Jeannie gave Chelsea a shot, the 15-month-old had a seizure and stopped breathing. Jeannie rode in the ambulance with Chelsea. She was pronounced dead at the hospital. That afternoon, Jeannie returned to work at the clinic. At the clinic, Jeannie was examining a month-old baby named Jacob Evans. Jacob's 19-year-old mother thought he had been crying a lot, and she thought that this was odd. While Jeannie was examining the baby alone, he suddenly stopped breathing. Jacob was taken to the hospital, and he recovered. Jacob's parents were incredibly thankful that Jeannie was there to save him. On September 18th, Jeannie met with a family without Dr. Holland being at the clinic. The parents were worried that their month-old son, Anthony Wynn, was having a medical issue. Jeannie examined him and then announced he was about to go into a coma because his blood sugar was low. Jeannie called an ambulance and then she rode with Anthony to the emergency room in the ambulance. Tests were performed on Anthony at the hospital, but the medical staff could find nothing wrong with him. He was released from the hospital after 4 days. On September 23, 1982, 5-month-old Rolinda Ruff was brought into the clinic. Jeannie gave Rolinda an IV. Minutes later, Rolinda stopped breathing and she had to be rushed to the hospital. By the time they got to the hospital, Rolinda was breathing and her color was returning. When Rolinda stopped breathing, Chris Parker and his mother were at the clinic. Chris had visited the clinic a few weeks earlier. During his visit, he stopped breathing and he had been hospitalized for 4 days. When Rolinda stopped breathing, Jeannie told Chris's mother to bring him to the hospital and she would examine Chris there. While Rolinda was being evaluated in the emergency room, Jeannie examined Chris. Suddenly, Chris went into cardiac arrest. The medical staff was able to get him breathing again. On the bed where Chris went into cardiac arrest, a doctor found a half-full syringe. Dr. Holland disposed of the syringe without finding out what was inside of it. Chris stayed in the hospital for a short time and then he was released. The doctors at St. Peterson wondered why so many children were having seizures and going into cardiac arrest at the clinic. In less than 2 months, 8 children had been brought to the emergency room from Dr. Holland's clinic. One doctor decided to investigate the women who ran the clinic. The detective called the Bexar County Hospital and he learned that several people at the hospital had suspected that Jeannie was hurting children. Dr. Holland was interviewed by officials at St. Peterson. She was asked if her clinic used a muscle relaxant called succinylcholine. Blood tests had been done on some of the children who came from her office. Traces of succinylcholine were found in their bloodstream. Succinylcholine would have caused the symptoms seen in the children that came from the clinic. After the meeting, Dr. Holland went back to her clinic and discovered that a ball of succinylcholine was missing. Only she and Jeannie had access to the room where the drugs were held. The missing bottle of succinylcholine was later found in a refrigerator in the clinic, and it was apparent that someone had stuck a needle through the rubber top multiple times. It also appeared that no liquid was missing from the bottle. Testing was done, and it turned out that someone had watered down the drug with salt water. This suggests that someone stole some of the drug and replaced it with salt water. Dr. Holland then searched her records and found out that a third bottle of succinylcholine had been ordered without her knowledge, and it was nowhere to be found. On September 27, 1982, Jeannie tried to overdose on pills. After she took the pills, she called Dr. Holland. Dr. Holland convinced her to check into a hospital. Soon afterward, Jeannie quit her job at the clinic and moved to San Angelo, Texas. Meanwhile, a criminal investigation was unfolding. Before Jeannie left town, she took a polygraph exam where she was asked questions about harming the children. The examiner determined she was not telling the truth. At first, the police and the district attorney were not sure if Kathy Holland was involved in the deaths and near deaths of the children. Dr. Holland's lawyer got in touch with the district attorney, and Dr. Holland agreed to work with them. On May 6, 1983, the body of Chelsea McClellan was exhumed. An autopsy was performed, and traces of succinylcholine were found in her bloodstream. 3 weeks later, Jeannie Jones was charged with Chelsea's murder. In November 1983, Jeannie was charged with injury to a child in the case of Orlando Santos, who nearly died in the Bexar County Hospital in January 1982. Jeannie's trial for the murder of Chelsea McClellan started in mid-January 1986. She pleaded not guilty. The prosecution was allowed to talk about other deaths and near deaths of children who had been in Jeannie's care. A string of witnesses testified that they saw Jeannie inject several children with some type of substance just moments before they stopped breathing or went into cardiac arrest. Dr. Kathy Holland testified against Jeannie. She told the court that before every time a child had been sent to the emergency room, Jeannie had been alone with them. She also talked about the missing succinylcholine from her clinic. Dr. Holland said that succinylcholine could have caused the children to have the symptoms like the ones they had at her clinic. Jeannie had planned to take the stand in her own defense, but then she and her lawyers decided she would not testify. The trial took just over a month. The jury spent about 45 minutes waiting for documents, and then they had an hour for lunch. They only spent an hour discussing the case before reaching a unanimous decision. They found Jeannie Jones guilty of murder. The next day, Jeannie was sentenced to 99 years of prison. 8 months later, Jeannie was found guilty of injury to a child in the case of Orlando Santos. She was sentenced to 60 years in prison, which was to run concurrently with her 99-year sentence. It's suspected that between 1977 and 1982, Jeannie Jones killed around 60 children. For some perspective, Ted Bundy confessed to 30 murders, and John Wayne Gacy has 33 confirmed victims. In October 1989, Jeannie applied for parole for the first time. Her request was denied. She continued to apply for parole every few years, but she was denied every time. In 1977, the prisons in Texas were overcrowded. To alleviate that, a law was passed that freed inmates after they served a third of their sentence. The law was changed in 1987 to exclude violent offenders, and then it was abolished in 1996. But none of these changes were retroactive, so Jeannie was able to take advantage of the law. She was set to be released in March 2018 at the age of 67. Obviously, many people were upset by this prospect. So on May 25, 2017, Jeannie was charged with the December 1981 murder of 11-month-old Joshua Sawyer. Less than a month later, she was charged with the September 1981 murder of 2-year-old Rosemary Vega. A few days later, Jeannie was indicted for the murder of 8-month-old Richard Nelson, who died in July 1981, and the murder of 4-month-old Patrick Zavalia, who died in January 1982. Then 4 months later, Jeannie was charged with the September 1981 murder of 4-month-old Paul Villarreal. The district attorney's office felt like they could prosecute her on all 5 cases. Jeannie has never publicly confessed to the murders, but she has admitted wrongdoing to several people. For example, in October 1998, she told a parole officer that she had killed those babies. She admitted she had killed more children than Chelsea McLennan, which was her only murder conviction. In 2011, Jeannie wrote to the Texas Board of Nursing. She wrote that what she did was heinous, and she was heinous. But she claimed she had not been in her right mind. In May 2011, Jeannie confessed to a parole commissioner that she had injected that girl with a substance. Who she meant by that girl wasn't exactly clear, but it's believed she was talking about Chelsea. Jeannie was set to go to trial for the 5 murders in February 2020. But in January 2020, Jeannie made a plea deal. She would be sentenced to life in prison in exchange for pleading guilty to the murder of Joshua Sawyer, and the other charges would be dropped. She would have to serve a minimum of 20 years of prison. Jeannie was credited with 2 years time served while she was awaiting trial, so she'll be able to apply for parole in 2038 when she's 87 years old. The motive for Jeannie's murders was never discussed at any of her trials. That was because the prosecution felt like they did not have to give a motive for a conviction. It's believed that Jeannie's desire to harm children was factitious disorder imposed on another, which is also known as Munchausen by proxy syndrome. She liked to put children in danger so she could save them. When they would die, she would put on a big display of grief that would rival the parents of the dead child. Jeannie Jones is currently incarcerated at the Dr. Lane Murray Unit, which is a women's prison located in Gatesville, Texas. That's all for today's video. Thank you so much for watching. If you're looking for something new to watch, please check out my new channel, Chapter Dark, which I started with the creator of Top 5 Unknowns. Each week we'll release a video with a fictional mystery that you have to solve. If you like escape rooms, puzzles, riddles, or loved Encyclopedia Brown, you'll hopefully dig Chapter Dark. Most weeks we'll have a guest star from another YouTube channel or a podcast. Our first guest star is the creator of the fantastic YouTube channel Heavy Case Files, which you should also check out. We post a new puzzle video every Saturday at 3 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. So please check out Chapter Dark and subscribe so that you don't miss a video. You can find a link to the channel in the description box below. Once again, thank you so much for watching this video. If you found it interesting, please give us a thumbs up and subscribe for more videos just like it. You can now find us on Instagram. Our username is @criminally_listed. You can also check us out on Facebook and Roku. The links are in the description box below this video. Also, check out criminallist.com where you can find information on exclusive podcasts, suggest cases, and buy merch. But that's all for today. Thanks again for watching, and please stay safe.